Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're calling in from. We'll just give about another minute or two to let people trickle in from the waiting room before we get started. But in the meantime, if you wanted to just drop in the chat where exactly you're joining the call from, can just give a sense of like the geographic diversity of the audience right now. Boston, okay. New York, Minnesota. Nice, everybody's in the US. Rwanda, hi Jimmy. Thanks for joining. Very late for you. Ireland, okay. Charlottesville, LA, Virginia. Very cool. Japan, okay. That's hopefully not too early for you. Just give it like another minute or so. Got about 20 people that have joined so far. DC. All right. Well, I think Amanda, if you can just keep letting people in, as they enter the waiting room, I can go ahead and get started, and the session will be recorded and made available afterwards in case you need to drop off early. So again, big thanks to all of you who have joined this session called Winning Tips for Your Schwarzman Scholars Application. My name is Michael Gallo, and I'm an alumnus of the seventh cohort of the Schwarzman Scholars program. And I'm now a coach on Leland for master's programs and competitive graduate fellowships. So pleasure to be with you here all today. And I'll give you a brief overview of what we'll be covering in the event. So I'll start by sharing about my background and my journey of being accepted to Schwarzman Scholars. And then we'll transition to discussing my advice and kind of pro tips on the two main components of the Schwarzman Scholars application, which are the leadership essay and the statement of purpose. And I'll also share some general tips for like your overall application strategy that you can keep in mind. And lastly, I'll share, why I became a coach in the first place, why I'm hosting events like these, and potentially how I can help you make your application stand out amongst what is certain to be a very competitive application pool for this scholarship. And then hopefully leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the very end of the session that you can ask me any questions that you may have. So a little bit about myself. I have a variety of professional experiences so far in my career, and I've kind of made pivots across different industries and focus areas. So since graduating college back in 2019, I landed my first job working for the United Nations in Macau, which is a special administrative region of China. So a bit of a, bizarre start to a career that's like a casino enclave in China, and there's a UN office there. It's a long story, but I then eventually went on to do some research consulting work for another UN agency that was based out of the headquarters in New York City. And then prior to entering Schwarzman in 2022, I was working for a public sector innovation project that was linked with the Supreme Court of the US state of Utah. And since graduating from Schwarzman last year, I've been working for a digital health technology startup that's based out of Singapore called Swipe RX. And as far as my educational background, obviously I received a Master's of Management Science degree in Global Affairs from Tsinghua University as part of the Schwarzman College. And I got my undergraduate degree from a small liberal arts school in the US called Moravian University, where I had studied biochemistry. So before jumping into, any concrete insights or advice, I wanted to just give a firsthand perspective of my own application journey, because exactly 3 years ago, around this time, I was preparing to apply for the program myself. Um, and so I can relate to like the exact position that many of you are in right now, contemplating or, beginning to prepare your applications with the deadline just 2 months away. So I had actually learned about Schwarzman Scholars for the first time in late 2020, but this was just a few weeks before the deadline. So I decided I didn't have a sufficient amount of time to really prepare and give it my best shot. And I also thought that I could potentially be more competitive if I had another year of work experience and really took the time to think more deeply about how I could position myself relative to the stated, mission and values of the program. So I pretty much used a year between late 2022 and the application deadline in 2021 for a lot of introspection about what I was looking for in life and career, not necessarily just how I could stand out for this specific program, but more of reflecting on who I was and how I could authentically present myself in any context, not necessarily just for the purpose of this application. Um, so all of you are already at least one step ahead of where I was at the time because I never attended an info session about Schwarzman Scholars. I never reached out to any alumni via LinkedIn or anything like that. I just very naively read what was required for the application on the website and applied, and that was it. So, keep in mind that a lot of you are already taking steps to think about how to best, prepare and make your application competitive. And it's a long process, but you try to pick up little tidbits of information here and there and bring it all together before you actually submit. So although I didn't do the typical outreach, to program alumni, I do have a very funny anecdote about something I did to try and increase my chances of getting accepted. So I'd been living in China at the time, and I was learning about the Chinese traditional practice of feng shui, which is used to direct the flow of energy through the universe. It's kind of involved in like the design of buildings, and it's considered to be something that's like essential to good luck and bringing good fortune. So I had a Chinese friend of mine actually consult a feng shui master about what was like the best date and the best time of day and the best orientation relative to the sun to actually click the button to submit my application. So I have a little video of it where at like 2:35 p.m. on Friday, September 10th in 2021, while I was facing northeast, I actually submitted my application for Schwarzman. And as a full disclaimer, I'll never know if that actually made a difference or not. But I knew that regardless of the outcome, I was very proud of myself for like having taken a chance for something that, had a low probability of actually working. And I learned a lot about myself along the way. Um, so then 2 months later, I was, pleasantly surprised when I was invited to an interview in early November, which was actually done online at the time due to COVID restrictions. And just about a week after I had the interview, it went well. I received a phone call, and it was one of the happiest moments of my life, letting me know that I had been accepted into the seventh cohort of Schwarzman. So eventually they sent me, this cool little gift box there in the middle leading up to the start of the year. And since it would take me at least another few hours to describe all of the adventures that I had during my year at Schwarzman, I'll just fast forward and, on the right there, you can see a picture of me about a year ago today on my graduation where I'm standing in the inner courtyard of Schwarzman College. So what did I learn from, reflecting on my own successful application and what I've garnered from helping others while working on theirs? And we can start with the leadership essay, which is one of the two main parts of your application. And the prompt from the portal asks you to describe one distinct example that illustrates who you are as a leader and how you think about leadership. Normally, the most effective method one can use to convey this example is by presenting a story or a narrative. So we can start by looking at the leftmost panel on the screen here, where now I've chatted with several dozen people who have been interested or already applied to Schwarzman Scholars. And one sentiment that I often hear is that they're intimidated by the accomplishments of program alumni and kind of in like a almost a whimsical way, they say, oh, well, I wasn't on the Forbes 30 under 30 list, or, I didn't start my own company or my nonprofit. I wasn't the student body president of my university, so I'm sure I have no chance, right? And I would really encourage you all to like not undersell or underestimate your leadership experiences, particularly by comparing yourself against the people that have already done the program, and you can read their bios online, because I don't think it's productive. And it's important to remember that the program doesn't have an explicit set of criteria of what types of leadership experience or styles that they're looking for. And so I don't believe that one is any better than another. It's just about how do you frame, what your experience was and what did you learn from it. But a very important thing to consider is that Schwarzman Scholars really wants candidates who not only have demonstrated leadership experience, but also very high ceilings of leadership potential. So you should consider choosing an example from your experiences where you're able to get a letter of recommendation from somebody who has either supervised you in a leadership capacity or supported you either directly or indirectly in a leadership initiative, and have been able to kind of witness the evolution and transformation of your leadership across time. And that way it enables them to be able to speak to your long-term leadership potential. Um, Another thing that I've observed in reading some, essays of other applicants is that they tend to make this leadership essay overly aspirational when they talk about, what they want their leadership to be in the future, rather than focusing on how they've demonstrated leadership capabilities and qualities in the past. And I think this relates back to the first point where maybe people are trying to subconsciously account for the fact that they don't believe that what they did was, so-called like enough to be able to make them stand out. But again, you should really be rooted in what you've done and think long and hard about how your unique leadership experiences are able to set you apart, and not by comparing them to anybody else who is either, interested in the program or has done the program already. Um, so moving to the middle panel here, I think that one important element that is often entirely missing, or at least very underrepresented in the leadership essay amongst applicants, are your core leadership values. So earlier I had mentioned how I took a long time to really deeply reflect on how I wanted to lead and the difference that I wanted to make in the world through my leadership. So your leadership essay is very narrative based and should be telling a story, but oftentimes weaker essays or unsuccessful applications kind of read just like you're listing a bunch of bullets on your CV about a leadership experience, but you're just putting them in chronological order and thinking that that tells a story. Um, but instead, Schwarzman places a lot of emphasis on identifying candidates who are more values-driven leaders. And these values can range from anything from empathy, inclusion, resilience, etc., like these types of intangible character traits that are manifested, through your leadership vision for yourself. And that's what they care about more so than, were you the student body president or did you start a company? But more so, how do you think of yourself as a leader and understand yourself as a leader? How does that influence, your motivations to achieve impact within the world? And so another thing that will oftentimes trip people up on this, if they do discuss their values, they oftentimes will just say like, "Oh, I am an empathetic leader," or "I value empathy, in my leadership style," but then fail to provide an illustrated example of how they did that within the broader context of the example that they've chosen to highlight in their leadership narrative. So you shouldn't be trying to tell the admissions committee that I am an empathetic leader, or, I embody resilience in my leadership style, but you should really be showing them through, laying it out directly and then showing an example that, illustrates that. So lastly, to look at the far right panel there, I think it's critical in this essay to strike a balance between three things: motivation, process, and outcomes. So what do I mean by this? When you narrow down the example that you want to use for this essay, you should first and foremost really focus on the why behind your decision to step up and fill a leadership role or answer the call to leadership in whatever manner that you did. And then next, you should think about what actions did you take once you were actually within a leadership position? And most importantly, what did you learn as a result of this experience? So weaker essays will tend to just give a very strong description of like what happened in one's leadership experience, but they fail to connect back to the bigger picture question of like the why, which is again related to your leadership values and your leadership style. Um, so then when you want to highlight the actual outcomes of your leadership experience, you can try to quantify whatever dimensions are possible, meaning you reached like X number of people through your initiatives or you raised X amount of money, etc. But going back to the point that I made on the first slide, you shouldn't undersell yourself or your accomplishments by thinking what you did wasn't big or impactful enough because those values that you come up with to boil down, what you did don't seem to be very big. So in my own leadership narrative that I wrote about, the outcomes in my case were that we had impacted about 1,000 people in our local community and raised $10,000 associated with the different initiatives that I described. So in an absolute sense, that's, not world changing, right? But it made an impact within its relative context, and it was a deeply transformational experience for me. So that's actually what they're looking for instead of trying to, speak to what you think would make a good headline for them to advertise about you as a leader. The next major component of your Schwarzman application will be your statement of purpose essay. And again, drawing the prompt from the application portal. In this essay, you're instructed to tell us about your professional or academic interests and goals as you see them now. Essentially, what is, the particular issue that's the focus of your motivation? Why are you interested in that? And why do you think it will continue? And lastly, what are some of the major factors that are involved in shaping this issue? And what's your leadership vision to drive change around it? So when I've reviewed essays from applicants in the past, I've observed that people frequently fail to give adequate contextualization to the scope of the issue that is their specific interest. So you need to remember that the admissions committee who are actually reading these essays, they work in the field of higher education and they're not specialized in any specific academic or professional area. And you're writing to a very generalist audience. So you want to assume that they probably aren't aware to the same degree that you are about why this specific issue is important for the world, and why they should care. So you need to lay it out very clearly and not just make the implicit assumption that they'll be able to interpret the meaning of it and like read between the lines. And on that point, you should also avoid using acronyms and technical jargon wherever possible. Or if you do, just make sure that you provide an explanation of what you mean in a simple manner. Because when you're reading through, many, many essays, as the admissions committee does in a short period of time, you don't want to take the time to have to Google an acronym or to reread something because you couldn't understand, what it meant. It's just not good from a time efficiency standpoint. Um, and to the second point on the panel to the far left there, my recommendation around how you set the stage and kind of define the scope of the problem within this essay is by drawing on facts and figures that describe how many people are affected by this issue, either worldwide or from a specific region or whatever your country of focus is. And you should try to draw this information from reputable sources of data like the United Nations, national government databases, or other organizations like the World Economic Forum, because you want to let the admissions committee know why it's important to solve this issue, and specifically why you are well positioned to make an impact in this area. And that could be because of who you are in, your personal identity, a specific professional experience that you've had, or any impactful thing that's happened in your life that really sparked your interest and sustained your motivation to try to build skills and relevant expertise in this area. So moving to the middle panel then, I think this essay is also the ideal platform to really answer the why China question. So Schwarzman Scholars is hosted at Tsinghua University, which is the top university in China, and the program has an explicit mission of trying to build better understanding between China and the rest of the world. And since, the reform and opening up period of the 1980s, for those of you who are familiar with Chinese history, the country has undergone very rapid and dynamic changes within its economy, its relationships with other countries internationally, and the types of policies that they've implemented domestically as well. So regardless of what issue you're, trying to address and speaking to in this essay, it's very likely that by studying China's historical context and its development trajectory in a deeper way through Schwarzman scholars, there are some type of transferable lessons that you could garner to implement solutions in other parts of the world, whether that's on a local or a global scale. So they're looking for people who want to come to China to essentially learn from China's experience, take those lessons back out to the rest of the world, um, and not only build better relations between countries, but also more effectively disseminate like best practices in a variety of areas. So you don't need to actually be an expert on Chinese politics or the Chinese economy, but it is important that when you're building out your application essays, that you do a lot of in-depth research and not just say that you're interested in China, because that's kind of a baseline assumption for anyone that would want to apply to Schwarzman scholars. Um, so it can be very evident when you're reading an essay from the admissions side of things when you see that somebody hasn't really sufficiently researched the topic of interest, that they're trying to say, well, it's important for me to get to China so I can learn about this, but then they stop there. Whereas if you link to some contextual examples of, what has happened in China's own history or giving examples from its contemporary developments, that it like effectively demonstrates that you have intercultural competencies and you're trying to understand the issue from China's vantage point, which is why they're looking to try and attract international scholars to study at Tsinghua in the first place. And this is a very critical skill for global leaders to be able to have. So lastly, looking at the far right-hand panel, you do actually need to answer the last part that the question asks, which is, what is your leadership vision to drive positive global change? So many times, I've looked at the statement of purpose essay, and it's just never explicitly included, but that's part of the question. And the reason that they include this in the statement of purpose rather than in the leadership essay is because the admissions committee wants to really gauge how do you anticipate becoming a leader within your area of domain expertise and understand how Schwarzman Scholars fits into that picture of your own professional development trajectory. So you want to be very specific here, as specific as possible. Don't be, saying these broad things like I want to change the world or make a positive impact. You should say, I want to become a global leader in global health in X geography, pursue a further specialization in infectious diseases or diplomacy in order to effectively build international partnerships. Um, Now, that's just like one example. Each of you will have your own version of that that's tailored to your experiences and your interests. But the important thing is that you include a forward-thinking statement about where you believe you may end up after Schwarzman. And realistically, changing the world is not something that happens overnight. And more often than not, it takes a long time to actually affect change through building the right relationships, having the right knowledge and vision. So be ambitious, but also be grounded, especially when you're talking about things on, a global scale. It might be more realistic to actually say that, you care very deeply about a local issue in your home country or in a place that you've lived or a place that's, affected by conflict, something like that. So the last part of like my, tips and tricks that I'd have to offer is by looking from the point of view of like the Schwarzman scholars frequently asked questions, because people always say, well, isn't the leadership essay the most important part, or isn't the statement of purpose, the second most important part when they're looking at your candidacy? But they specifically state that there is no single most important element of the application. They read each application carefully and kind of take a holistic approach to evaluating each candidate. So yes, your essays are very important that you write them well, but they're not the only thing that matters. So your short answer questions, of which there are two, are also very important, and they shouldn't be overlooked just because they only require 100 words in your response. So the first question asks about how do you see Schwarzman College essentially advancing your interests or goals or impact? And a very common pitfall that people run into here is they say extremely generic things, like the Schwarzman Alumni Network is extremely diverse, and there's people from many different nationalities that will be part of the program. So I have a lot of global perspectives to learn from. And to be honest, like the Schwarzman committee, they already know that. That's why they built the program. So you're not saying anything new there by just, echoing some of the things that they advertise as like the value proposition of the program. So you want to more effectively set yourself apart by mentioning specific elements of the program, such as coursework or experiential learning opportunities, such as the deep dive, as a unique way of how you would plan to use your time while in China, while at Schwarzman, to make, the next transition stage in your career or in your education. And the next 100 word answer, short answer that they give you the space to talk about something that the admissions committee otherwise wouldn't know about you. And I think that this is an ideal place to really provide information that showcases your candidacy in a holistic manner. So you could talk about how perhaps you overcame significant adversity in your life in order to achieve your goals, or what your unique contribution to like the diversity, equity, and inclusion elements of the program are. For example, being the first in your family to attend college, or coming from a low income background. I think that this is an appropriate place to actually share some of that stuff so the committee gets a more well-rounded sense of not just who you are as a professional and as a student, but also as a person. So looking at the middle panel then, I think the two most important concepts across your entire application should be information triangulation and reducing cognitive load. So on the first part, I think that it's important to find ways that reinforce key themes across your application through the different mediums that you have, so that your interests and your leadership traits aren't really segmented into just one area or another, but that they're very complementary. And so you can think of it almost as leaving like a little trail of breadcrumbs about who you are and what motivates you in each piece of the application in some fashion. And that way the admissions committee can see a common thread that weaves through, your experiences, your activities, and your interests. You also have to keep in mind that last year there was a record number of applications, more than 4,000. So while it is guaranteed that your application will be thoughtfully, read by someone, they have such a high volume and such a short period of time to turn those around. It's very possible that a member of the AdCom is reading it, on the way on the subway into work when they're taking a lunch break, maybe late in the evening when they're back home with their family. So you want to reduce the cognitive load, meaning like the difficulty that it will take to understand the key messages that you want to present about yourself. So it's important that you use very clear, concise, and confident communication when you're describing your skills and experiences. And lastly, looking at the far right panel, the things I can't emphasize enough are attention to detail, preparation, and authenticity. So firstly, the application deadline has no exceptions whatsoever, and they make this very clear. It doesn't matter if your internet went down because of a storm, if you had an emergency with your family, if your dog got sick, if you broke up with your partner. If you do not submit the application by the deadline, you will not be considered and you will have to wait another whole year in order to be able to apply. And on the point of preparation, details matter a lot, and you will want to read and reread all of your materials multiple times to check for spelling and grammar errors, as well as ensuring consistency and coherence in your language and word choice. Now, I don't say this to scare you, but realistically, a lot of people who get accepted spend more than 100 hours in total working on their applications across time, trying to ensure that it's perfect and that there are no mistakes. So if you spell the program name wrong, for example, it's just a bad look and it may reduce your competitiveness compared to another person who really took the time and effort to make sure that it was error-free. And lastly, regarding your letters of recommendation, I strongly advise against picking recommenders who don't know you well, but maybe happen to have like a fancy or prestigious title in their respective organization. It's far more important that you have someone who can speak very directly to the content of your character and your leadership potential, specifically because you have had a close relationship with them across time. You shouldn't ask like a family member or somebody else who may have like a conflict of interest or an incentive to misrepresent you or overstate your accomplishments in their recommendation because the admissions committee will see through that very quickly. Um, and the last thing that I have to say is you shouldn't be so overly focused on career and education that you forget to let your personality shine through in like any way. So in the 1 minute video introduction that you have, I recommend you try to be as creative and non-conventional as possible. If you just stand there like very ramrod and read off your CV and your academic background, there's no unique differentiator in that part of your application. So in my video for my application, I used footage from me skydiving and bungee jumping and hiking to kind of showcase, my energetic nature. And I'm not very skilled in multimedia or content creation, so you shouldn't wait to do this till like the very, near deadline because it will take a lot longer than you expect. It's only 60 seconds, but you have to make a lot of takes of it, edit the footage, splice it together, to actually make like a compelling video. So that wraps up the tips that I think are most important to keep in mind from like a high level when reviewing or preparing your applications. But before we move to Q&A, I'd like to just share a bit about my personal journey since graduating from Schwarzman and how that actually led me to hosting a session like this, joining Leland, and becoming an applications coach for programs like Schwarzman. So I was the first person from my undergraduate institution to be accepted into Schwarzman Scholars, and the first to ever really win a prestigious international graduate fellowship of a similar nature. So there was no template that I could follow. No one was there to really guide me when I was trying to make sense of the application process, and nobody really encouraged me to apply in the first place. So as I had mentioned, I also didn't attend any info sessions or reach out to program alumni because it didn't even occur to me that that was something you could do. But when I got to Schwarzman and I started chatting with my classmates, I realized that my case was an exception rather than the norm. And so most people that were accepted had a tremendous amount of support from their university fellowship office. They were talking to alumni who came from their, respective undergrad schools. They were being mentored on like strategies and best practices. And so that's why I think that I've always liked the saying that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And so it's a reality that many people who get accepted to programs like Schwarzman come from, significant educational or economic advantages. But I didn't let that, dissuade me from applying to the program and telling my story. And so it took me until after I had actually left Schwarzman last year to realize that I think what set me apart from everyone and ultimately got me accepted was my ability to authentically tell my story, which was a skill that I never had intentionally tried to develop. But once I started helping others on their applications, I realized that I truly enjoyed learning other people's stories and kind of acting as a sounding board to give them insights as to how they might best craft their own stories through a platform like applying to Schwarzman. And so the program has, forever changed my life as a result of participating in it. And I want to give back by investing in other future leaders to help them work towards, their educational goals and also to help level the playing field a little bit for maybe some of those who didn't have access to the same institutional resources. And as far as my outcomes since I've started coaching, actually, since graduation, I worked very closely with two individuals who were subsequently accepted into Schwarzman Scholars during a past application cycle. So it's only about 140, 150 people, but I got two of them there. And then in the current application cycle, I actually helped to coach two Chinese applicants who were finalists for the scholarship and just last week had their interviews in Beijing and are currently awaiting their decision. And because I'm now on, Leland, I'm able to more effectively reach a larger audience. And I'm currently supporting 6 other US and global candidates for this year's application cycle. And the most deeply fulfilling part of being a coach to me are these moments when you know that you've actually made a difference in someone's life. So one of the reviews that I have on Leland is from one of the two people that I actually coached who went on to be accepted into Schwarzman. And I can genuinely say that when I found out they had gotten in, I was as happy for them as when I actually got my own acceptance call because I know what it means to be selected for a scholarship like this. And so, what I especially loved about this review was that the person not only found my feedback to be helpful, but also that I helped them to, believe in themselves and their success more deeply. So that leads me to how can I help you? And as a coach on Leland, the platform that's brought us all together here tonight, I'm offering a coaching package called Mastering Your Master's Application, which includes very like end-to-end support for your application through an initial consultation and a brainstorming session, helping you to develop and edit your essays, reviewing your CV, as well as reviewing your entire application document before submission and also includes conducting mock interviews should you be, selected as a finalist to help you prepare for that experience. And I also have hourly coaching for all of the same services that I had just mentioned. And you can learn more about that and also share, with me about your motivations applying for the program by scheduling a 15-minute interview call through the link that I believe Amanda has shared in the chat. And so just as a special gift for all of you who have joined tonight on a, Friday night or across time zones, you can get a 10% off discount for any of my coaching services by scanning the QR code that's on the slide or clicking the link Amanda shared in the chat to view my profile, and then including the discount code Michael G winning tips 10 if you go to purchase and decide to work with me as a coach. So I know I probably went a little bit over time, but we also started, 5 minutes or so late. So I'm happy to hang on and to answer any questions that you may have. So feel free to raise your hand. I'll leave the QR code up on the slide and or just drop your questions in the chat and I'll try to get to as many as I can. Thanks.
Hey, Michael, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Thank you for the session. I wanted to ask, in your experience, both personal and as a coach, if proficiency in Mandarin is a factor that sets candidates apart, or proficiency in other languages. I'm originally from Mexico, but I was educated in the U.S., so I also speak English. I wanted to ask again the foreign language question. Does that have any pull in the decision?
hmm Yeah, it's a great question, and there's no requirement that you already have prior knowledge of Mandarin. And actually, to a certain extent, I think that having very high degrees of Chinese proficiency, especially as a foreigner, may almost work against you because Schwarzman Scholars is kind of developed as like an intro to China, like a very China 101. You're only there for 1 year. So to reasonably expect that you would go from like no fluency to perfect fluency in a short period of time is a bit unrealistic. So they don't weight candidates, more favorable if they've already had prior China exposure because they're trying to bring people who otherwise would have never gone to China to have a chance to be educated, to learn the language, etc.
Thank
Uh,
you.
yeah, yeah, of course. I see a question in the chat. Would you say that using an internship experience is good idea for the leadership essay? I think that if you can find some example of your leadership that has occurred outside of a professional setting, so maybe some community involvement that you've been a part of, or an initiative that you took when you were a student, that kind of is outside of like the traditional professional work experience, that would be able to more effectively set you apart. If you think that you don't have another good example for your leadership narrative, then it's fine to use that. But I would encourage you to kind of think outside of the box of other times that you've demonstrated leadership. Okay, Jimmy, I see you have your hand up.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, for the wonderful presentation. I'm
Mhm.
Jimmy. Originally, I'm from Uganda, but I'm living currently in Rwanda. So when I was reading the statement of purpose instructions, I landed on a section that was inquiring the applicants to show that their interest is not going to change
Mhm.
pertaining the global issue that they're interested in. How do you advise someone to link their future leadership plans, what they have done, and show that their interest is not going to change in the particular global issue that they're passionate about? And also, when writing the leadership essay, uh, there's a I understand that the, 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 the readers will really love to understand clearly your leadership values and what you. So should I mention my leadership values, or it is going to come out clearly as I go along drafting and improving every part of the leadership essay? So those are two. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I'll answer the first question first and then the second one afterwards. So I think that it is important to demonstrate that you're trying or planning to use the Schwarzman Fellowship to build upon an interest that you already have. So if you have an experience that started 3 4 years ago, and that either an internship or a research project led you to pursue something of a narrower scope, more specifically focused on an issue related to like health or technology policy, gender equality, whatever it may be. You want to show a linear progression of how all that you've done in the past has built up to why you think that Schwarzman would be good for you, and then where you see yourself going after. So you don't have to, define exactly like, I want to have this job upon graduation, but this manifests more when they ask you to describe your leadership vision. So to say that I want to be a leader in the global health space, for example, and then you narrow it down from there. So, you mentioned you're from Uganda, but you're working in Rwanda. So you may want to say, be a global health leader within sub-Saharan Africa or East Africa and specialize in, a specific area of medicine or public health. And that's the way of demonstrating that, you kind of have a plan of once you get to the program, you'll be able to best utilize the resources that are available to get you to where you envision yourself being. Because nobody at the program is actually going to tell you what to do. It's very much self-directed. So they provide the ecosystem and a lot of resources to support you, but you have to determine how you use, the opportunities that are afforded to you, through the experience. And then on the second part, I think that the leadership values, like you can actually include a statement like, I am my leadership value, and this experience reinforced my leadership values of empathy, inclusion, resilience, were like the examples that I gave. And then, like, the example for each of those doesn't have to come immediately after you've stated that, but it can be, 2 paragraphs later in your essay, or it can be in your statement of purpose when you talk about your leadership vision, or it could be, described in one of your, 10 professional or leadership experiences in the other part of the application. And that's what the point I was trying to get at about information triangulation. So you want to leave little bits and pieces of, your leadership values and your experiences across all of the different components of the application. I see Famid. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly.
No, that's fine. It's Famid. That's all right. Don't worry about that. Thank you. Thank you for your time, by the way. So I just wanted to ask about, so I took a look at Leland's coaching and the different mentors, and I wanted to ask, how important do you think it is to find a mentor who has a similar background as far as like professional experience versus more on the personal side? Like, do you think that's a big thing to consider as you're crafting your application and everything?
Yeah, I think that, and that's a great question. First of all, I think the number of coaches that have done Schwarzman on Leland are pretty limited. I'm not sure if there's, other competitor platforms that people are doing coaching on, but I think in the case, because Leland has, many coaches who also just offer general coaching services that are not specific to like a master's, program or a scholarship like Schwarzman. I would say that the background of the coach doesn't matter so much as the coach's experience and insider knowledge of how the process works. And really, I can't even describe to you how like valuable it is to see everything from the inside and then to be able to reflect back on my time before I had applied to the program and think like, wow, how did I get in when I didn't know so much of what I was able to learn about how the process works, what they're looking for. So yeah, I know I probably have some self-interest in, encouraging you to work with a coach that does or has background in the Schwarzman Scholars program specifically. And I think that other coaches may be helpful if they have like a background, if your background's in like investment or medicine, they could help with partly crafting, your story and your narrative, but they might not know the specifics about the program as well as someone who's actually done it. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that does. I think you sold yourself pretty well there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Joshan?
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, I actually have like two-part question. My first one is that, um, I thought about leadership experiences that I had in the past, but I don't think I can talk about anything that I actually make a difference. I was wondering if you have any recommendation on that. The second question is that I came from a business background. I had a bachelor and master in business. I'm currently working as an auditor with an accounting firm. But previous before I had internship with the State Department, I fell in love with it. So I really want to make that transition from going to I want to pivot away from business. I want to do global affairs, international development. I envision a career with either the state or USA. So I don't really have a particular interest or issue of interest in mind, but like I really see Schwarzman as an opportunity to pivot to have a career because I want that knowledge, I want that background, and I want that perspective. The question is, I guess it's related to the second question. I'm not sure how I can tie my interest to China. So like, yeah.
Yeah, and this is it's a issue that a lot of people I think struggle with because Schwarzman is also a great platform to be able to pivot to different things, because it offers, you know, a wide-ranging network and lots of exposure to different opportunities during the program. I would encourage you that, you know, you've already mentioned some specific pathways that you're considering and that you think Schwarzman could, you know, connect you to in your long-term vision. So do further research about if, you know, your background is in business and you're looking to pivot away from that. Try to find some intersection of where like you had mentioned, you know, diplomacy wanting to work for the State Department, but your background is in, you know, auditing and business. There is somewhere that the Venn diagram of those two things overlaps and how it relates to China. And so you want to kind of use your different experiences to create almost like a wedge that you can like get your foot in the door, right? The intention is that you actually get accepted into the program. And then once you do, you can study whatever you want, right? Like nobody's going to hold you to account. But also, if you deviate too far away from things that you've actually done, it can weaken the strength of your application because there's just not a lot of, you know, coherence across your narrative. You may be able to, you know, effectively convince them that you know, I've never done anything like this before, but this is how Schwarzman is going to, you know, change my life and set me on that path. But I think it's better to try to find like a middle ground that doesn't entirely exclude your previous experiences and your background because they're still valuable. So you don't want to discard them when you're talking about, you know, your interests and your trajectory. I see question in the chat. I want to know how much of academic excellence they're looking for to qualify for the scholarship. There's no minimum GPA requirement. So technically, as long as you will have completed a bachelor's degree at any accredited university by the time that you would matriculate into the program, you are eligible. However, I will say that most people who get accepted do have very high GPAs in whatever, you know, the education system of their country, like the numerical weighting. You should anticipate that people probably graduated in the top 10 to 20% of their classes. And they're very ambitious and have a lot of, you know, extracurricular activities, et cetera. It tends to attract that type of candidate, but there is no minimum requirement. So if on a 4.0 scale, your GPA was maybe 3.5 or 3.7, don't think that that's not good enough because maybe you have other qualities that they would deem to be more important relative to, you know, just the academic credentials. And that's why they evaluate candidates very holistically, because you're not just defined by your GPA or any of like your test scores. And they're really looking for like leadership qualities and characteristics, I would say, more so maybe than, you know, having extremely good grades. And I see another question. What would be the time frame of a leadership experience to choose? Would say, is 5 years prior still viable? So that's a great question. I used an experience from 3.5 years from the time that I wrote my application. So it wasn't something that I did like recently, but I found it to be kind of an inflection point in my own leadership journey. So that was why I chose to highlight it. And I also, because I chose something from so long ago, I made sure to include like the thread through this is what I did back then, and here's how it subsequently led me to where I am now. So I don't think there's necessarily a time limit on like how far back you can go, but just make sure that if it's not very recent, that you know, elucidate how it transformed you and led you to kind of where you are now. I see, I was wondering, would it be better to have a recommender, someone say a high school senior who hasn't worked with you in a formal capacity, but is able to attest to your character, achievements, ambitions, over time, or someone who has worked with you before, say a colleague, but doesn't know you that deeply over time, I would say you can go a bit unconventional and choose someone that knows you very well, even if it's not through a professional capacity. Just make sure that this in their relationship with you, it's not just, your close friend that can't actually effectively articulate why you would be a good fit for the program. And instead, they just say, oh, she's an awesome person. I really enjoy spending time with her. I think she's the best, whatever, because that's not going to, position you well. But if you have someone that has known you very well over time, I've heard of Schwarzman scholars who have graduated writing recommendations on behalf of people who are applying because they've known them for a long time, and so they can kind of vouch for their character and their attributes. So I would say it's definitely a possibility. You can consider it against the other options that you have when selecting a recommender. But yeah, I wouldn't exclude the option for that. It seems, Christy asks, it seems a lot of applicants have a background from a non-healthcare field. Do you think this program can also benefit medical students? So one of the two people that I actually coached to acceptance was a medical doctor at the time, or he was a third-year medical student, and then went to Schwarzman and returned to become a clinical physician afterwards. And in my class, the 7th cohort, there were actually 3 other students who were pursuing their medical degree that took a pause from their studies to then go back after Schwarzman to continue their medical education. And there was also one person who was actually a medical doctor practicing, who took a hiatus from working to do the program. So I think that medical students are certainly able to apply. You would need to just make sure that you're able to take a leave of absence from your program and that wouldn't interfere with completing the requirements of your degree. I see, can a school mental health counselor write a recommendation? Yeah, I think that's a great example of somebody who would be able to, especially if you've been going to this school counselor as you've been working through leadership challenges in an academic environment, and they've seen you learn and grow through introspection and reflection on what you've done and what you've learned from it. I think that's definitely a good possibility for a recommender. Famid, another question for you.
Yeah, sorry, man. So I just wanted to ask as far for the recommendations. So I went to a liberal arts school, and I was wondering, would it be a good, I guess, how would you feel if you get a recommendation from a professor in a completely different concentration than your major or your academic advisor? So, like for example, if I were to get a rec from a art history professor, who could speak to my intellectual curiosity, like, do you think that is a positive attribute? Would that contribute overall, or would it be better to get something more directly relevant to academic or professional background?
Yeah, I think that actually it's again, it's a non-conventional approach, but it could actually differentiate you in a unique way. Just make sure that, if you're choosing a professor from outside of your domain, that on your transcript it shows that like you actually had a class with this professor, and maybe you did, research or performed well in the class. That's reflected on like your grade on the transcript, and that they also have enough to say about you. Because I don't know, what your relationship is like with this specific professor, but if you only took that one class with them and then never talked to them again, it might be a bit odd to like approach them, and I don't know what their reaction would be exactly. Maybe they're happy to do it. But just make sure that if you do decide to select them, that they have enough to speak about for you on your behalf. Yes,
Cool,
Jimmy.
thanks.
Yeah, of course. Jimmy, another question?
Yes, thank you for giving me the second chance again. And I would like to know about future leadership plans or career plans. So when I'm writing, do you advise categorizing or classifying leadership vision into, like, for example, short term, mid-term, and long term. For example, you can be working in a health facility, and you may want to say, after graduation, I would like to go back to the facility and work as a quality improvement officer, would like to work as a in capacity building, conducting research, and at the same time, you may say in the midterm, would like to build a startups in something like to make a global organization that addresses this concern. Maybe after 5 years, I want to work as a minister of health in my home country, something like that. How should I structure it to? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I honestly, if that's like the vision that you see for yourself, the way that you just laid it out is a very effective way of structuring it. So you talked about kind of in an immediate sense, what you would plan to do after returning from Schwarzman, and then it also connects to the leadership element of the program by then you're elevating your ambitions to want to serve your government in like a higher capacity than just a short term, more technical or specialist role, but that you're building towards that vision, because that's one of the actual like key performance indicators of the program, is that they're looking to just create a large network of people that will eventually rise to leadership positions in government, in business, philanthropy, nonprofit world, etc. So if you demonstrate that you have the ambition and kind of a pathway towards being a leader, especially within your home country, I think that they would, definitely look favorably upon that. I also realize we are a bit over time. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Oh, Joshan, yes, you can go ahead.
Hi, Michael. I actually have questions about the recommender. So I graduated from my bachelor program. I actually applied last year, but I didn't get in. I want to apply again this year. So one of my recommenders, she would be my professor in college, but I took this class with her long time ago. Um, sh I know that they recommend you have to have one academic letter. Is it okay to not have a academic letter? I'm sure she will write for me again, but she is the only person that I can think of that could provide me with a letter of recommendation, like from the academic side, but she does not know me well outside of academics.
Yeah, I think that you definitely need a letter of recommendation from either a professor or a research assistant or somebody that's supervised you or worked closely with you in an academic setting. They do stipulate that on the website under the frequently asked questions. It's not necessary to have like multiple academic recommendations, but I would a way to approach it is there's still 2 months before the application deadline. So if you haven't spoken to this professor in a while, you could maybe reach out to her and say, "Oh, I was just thinking about what I learned from your class many, many years ago and how it changed me and my career or my interests. I would love to catch up with you sometime to tell you more about what I've been up to ever since." And then you can use that call to share more about where you went from when you took her class to where you are now. And that way she can know you better and speak to you more, effectively. And that way you're not just reaching out after many years of no contact and saying, "Can you give me this recommendation?" in like a very transactional sense, because the professor might ignore that, especially if they have a lot of requests for recommendations. I see in the chat, a teaching assistant would work in this situation. Yeah.
I also have a second question, which is about the leadership experience. Like I mentioned, I held leadership positions before, but it was not, I don't I don't see myself making an impact in it. I just I don't think I had any leadership experience to talk about. Could I go with a non-conventional way where I talk about how I got myself out of the situations, I guess not situation, but like going to college as a first gen without any support. And then where I'm at right now. Just I guess, can I go with a non? I don't know how to ask that question. Do you know what I'm trying to go?
Yeah, I get a sense of what you're trying to explain. Again, this is it the sentiment that you've shared is something I hear very often from people that are applying to Schwarzman is that I don't have any real leadership experience or I didn't make a big impact. Like I tried to emphasize at several points in the presentation that you don't need to have been the student body president or started a nonprofit or a tech company or any type of the conventional leadership roles. To me, and I also believe in the eyes of the Schwarzman program, leadership can be something that distills down to even just changing the life of a single person. um, the important thing is that you talk about how it shaped you as a leader, and like what you learned from that experience, regardless of the impact, right? Because the impact might be small in a sense. You're saying you're struggling to figure out, what you've done that's like so-called made a difference. But I think that when you expand your understanding or conceptualization of what leadership means, you can actually find many examples of ways in which you've probably touched people's lives that don't fit into a conventional box of leadership, which is typically just holding a position. And I see yes, we're one last question. And Amanda has also just shared a link to my profile one last time. So if you have any questions or you're interested in working with me, feel free to just drop me a message on Leland. You should be getting an email after some short period of time with a recording of the webinar. And I'm always available. Just go ahead and reach out. And thank you all for attending. And enjoy the rest of your evenings or days, depending on where you are in the world. Bye-bye.